this original music?
Not mine.
Hello, everybody.
Hello. Well, we are so excited to have everybody here today. Hi. I hope you are enjoying the Faith and OCD Conference, that you're having a wonderful time, and we are so thrilled to have you here for ERP as a spiritual practice. We are going to be spending a little bit of time with you today, of course, talking through exposure and response prevention, which we hope you have learned about in the first couple sessions of the conference. But we're also going to be looking at the ways that actually engaging in this treatment can serve as a spiritual practice that helps individuals reconnect with their faith. So in doing that, our agenda for you today is spending a little bit of time with introductions. We're each going to introduce ourselves in just a second. We are going to move into some psychoeducation, talk through the spirituality of ERP, talk through best practices for crafting exposures, and then we're going to conclude and have some time to connect with all of you on your questions. So we'll introduce ourselves really quick, and then we will kind of jump in. So I'm Katie. I am an ordained minister and interfaith chaplain who spent a long time in educational chaplaincy and who now works at the intersection of faith and OCD. I have OCD. I'm very open about what it means to be a minister with OCD. And I am particularly passionate about this topic. This topic has been the center of all of my doctoral work and really looking at how can this treatment serve as a spiritual practice across religious and spiritual traditions while folks reconnect with their values in authentic ways. And I'll pass it over to Justin to introduce himself and all of the awesome stuff that he does.
Hey, everybody. I'm Justin K. Hughes, licensed professional counselor, owner of Dallas Counseling PLLC. I'm a therapist, writer, and speaker, and just super passionate about the intersection of OCD and faith. And you can catch me in the sphere of all things advocacy, treatments of OCD and anxiety disorders, and just super honored to be here with Katie and Noah. Incredible, incredible people. So I'll pass it to Noah.
Yay. Hi, everybody. I am Noah Tile. I am a Canadian from Toronto, working in the field both from a psychotherapeutic standpoint. I'm a registered psychotherapist here, specializing in OCD and ADHD. I think that the overlap between the two is that both, I think, for me, are very goal-oriented and practical. I'm really, when it comes to OCD therapy, trying to help people beyond, of course, exposure therapy, as we're going to learn more about, especially in the spirituality of it, is super, super important. But my goal is always, how is OCD disrupting everybody's personal life, social life, relationship life, spiritual life, jobs, work? That's how I craft the work that I do with people to help them get back to those things, to stop avoiding. It's really a very practical focus. And I really love helping people really make moves and growth and see it and measure it. And of course, there's many different ways to do therapy, but that's what I love to do. And I'm also a rabbi involved both in the Jewish community. I'm from the Orthodox background, working with Jews across all different backgrounds, as well as the multi-faith context here with the IOCDF. And as well, lastly, just a business owner running a student mental health clinic that specializes in the intersection of mental health and school issues, really trying to get lower cost therapy out there in an accessible way.
I love that. Every time I find out more about y'all and the cool things that you're involved in. I love it.
I'm excited.
Right.
This is, and I'll tell everybody, this is like my favorite group of humans. So I have been excited to record this all day and my favorite topic. So I'm excited for us to dive in and get to chat about this. So I know Rabbi Noah Tile is going to get us started with some psychoeducation. And you are muted.
Perfect. Okay. So I was saying to myself that I'm aware that maybe you've been in multiple different presentations, both this one and every other one, and you are all very well versed in OCD language. I actually personally find that I have a problem with the OCD technical language. Now, all the clinicians and researchers there, please forgive me. I'm not going against the convention here, but I find that the word obsession and compulsion don't land as much in practical terms than the other words that I'm using there. So I'll try to explain to you a little bit about that. But I think that OCD gets a very bad rap for being very complicated. I'm not saying people are not complicated. People are deep. People are complex. People have multiple reasons why things have developed. but I actually think that OCD isn't a mystery in the sense of how it works. We have two moving parts, and those two moving parts actually intersect and map onto the treatment. And of course, there are many different types of treatments beyond ERP, but I think ERP for me is at least is it like when is it sufficient but not is it sufficient? It's necessary and sufficient, and there are other things that are I'm lost. Katie, just help me.
I don't know. I can't think of the phrase either.
I'm lost. I was a philosophy. My first undergrad was in philosophy. I'm going to apologize. Either way, ERP is a must. Other things can work really well, but I think ERP is a must. But we're going to go back because I haven't explained the first part. So when I work with clients, I actually use the word, I explain that there's obsession and compulsion, but I like to use the word intrusion. I think I lost. Oh, there we go. I like to use the word intrusion and ritual, and I'll explain why. So an intrusion or an obsession is the sort of unwanted, distressing thoughts, images, fears, sensations, feelings that arise and come up into awareness that are often involuntary. And they're usually triggered by something both in the environment, but sometimes a thought can be a trigger to lead to greater intrusions. It's sort of this instantaneous reaction to something that's happening to you. I call it an intrusion because I think it lands more well than what an obsession is, because in common culture, when we say obsession, we mean sort of a fixation and a need, a desiring for something in a way that it is excessive and maybe over the top, and a lot of passion and energy goes into it and attention. And so when someone says to me, for example, I'm obsessing, it doesn't really make sense, because I'm not obsessing. I'm having an obsession and I'm compulsing. So if anybody comes to me and says, I struggle a lot with my OCD, I obsess a lot, you're actually compulsing a lot. I mean, you're obsessing in the language that you use in everyday life, but really what you're doing is compulsing and probably ruminating, which is a form of compulsion. So I like to not get confused, and I say intrusion. And then for compulsion, I say ritual, because I think it really sums up, first of all, it's a spiritual thing. We can get into that word, ritual. But I like to just be very simple. The ritual is just the response that you make to the intrusion that comes up. It's usually quite rigid, quite repetitive. It can either be something that we can see, a covert behavior, or it can be something that we don't see but is happening inside of you, a mental behavior in response. But the reason why I like this word ritual, because I would include within a ritual also an avoidance being a ritual. Every time the trigger happens and then intrusion comes up, I do ritual avoidance. And so for compulsion, some people say, what are your compulsions and avoidance? I just like ritual because they say, what are the compulsive behaviors that you do? And what are the avoidance patterns that you do? And those are voluntary for the most. I think they're voluntary, but they're voluntary just like addiction can be voluntary, but still so extremely painful, hard to manage, almost feels like there's no choice. Same with like tics, picking behaviors. It feels like there's no choice, especially at the beginning, and especially when there's no gap between the intrusion and the response. And so we say voluntary because you do have a choice. It is a response, even though it's very hard to stop. And we do these rituals in order to, in some way, shape, or form, feel better. So we're feeling better in ourselves because we've alleviated a distressing emotion that came up because of the intrusion. And also for OCD, we do it because we think we're preventing various dangers. If I do the compulsion, if I do the ritual, if I do the avoidance patterns, I will prevent something bad from happening. Usually it's more in a mystical, magical way than it is in a correlation that you can like look at cause and effect. But that's kind of what we're up against here. We have really entrenched, difficult, distressing patterns that are activated by triggers and the ritual responses that we do. So we can go to the next slide. So goal for OCD therapy, and I'm making a dash there to be very clear. It's exposure and then response prevention. I don't do exposure therapy. I do exposure and response prevention therapy. Sometimes people do exposures. Exposures is when you purposely create triggers in your life that you know are likely to lead to intrusions of various kinds and a desire for rituals, a desire to do something about that. We expose people to that, and that exposure is correlated with the intrusions. We're exposing people to intrusions, and then we're doing response prevention, or perfectly well, ritual prevention from the RP. So we only have 4 moving parts in this: the O, the C, the E, and the RP. And of course, there's a lot of stuff to get into. You can go into core fears. You can go into cognitive parts to it. Oh, there we go. E is to the O, as RP is to the C. So exposure is to the obsession or to the intrusion, as response prevention is to the compulsion or the ritual. And we want to reduce the disorder. I was like, what is the D again? We want to reduce the disorder or the dysfunction that's causing somebody in their lives. And as an OCD therapist that integrates a lot of ACT therapy, I try my best to first make it value-based. And I'm sure Justin will get into it, Katie will get into it, value-based. And I also try, like, for example, if I have a client who's afraid to be around certain objects that could lead to doing dangerous things. Let's say they work as a mechanic or something like that. And I think I went big, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay, cool. So if I'm working with somebody that is afraid of certain types, they're working in electrical, as an electrician or something like that. They're working as, with difficult objects that can be scary, that can lead to violent outcomes. Instead of just having them, randomly go to a store and look at something or buy something, or that could be helpful. That's something that they're afraid about that leads to a lot of the avoidance and the rituals. But what I try to do is tie the exposure practices. Sometimes we have training, which is totally, as I mentioned, like doing things outside of their life. But I try to say, we want to get you back to the work that you're at. You work at a certain company. So let's purposely look at the environment. Let's look at the situation that you're in at the company and figure out how we can purposely trigger yourself at the work environment that you already want to get back to and do exposures there. So I look at a lot of the sort of hierarchical versions of ERP as getting you ready just for real life. And I often try to just go to real life right away while trying to manufacture as many exposures within the real life as possible. But the whole point and the goal is that we want to get to a place where we are triggered, because we can't control the intrusions. Our goal is never to stop what I write there is the O's. We're not trying to stop the O's. We're just trying to stop the C's. So O without C is the goal. To be triggered without the compulsion is the goal. And then we hope that by giving less and less attention to our intrusive thoughts, that they'll become less powerful over us. We learn new data. We learn that we can feel safe, and that many times that the dangers we were worried about, hopefully, never happen. But we learn that we can be safe, that we can handle what is coming up within us, and we don't need to ritualize in order to feel better. So when my clients, for example, if I have them expose themselves to a TV show for various reasons, maybe they're afraid of intrusive thoughts about, children or gender sort of identity things, and they're looking at something. If they're just going to then expose themselves to something that triggers them, but then do more compulsions as a response to their exposure, then I think it's counterproductive. I'm really trying to help people do exposure without the response prevention. And all efforts matter. All efforts are important. It's not a zero-sum game. Although I happen to when I know it's safe, we do a lot of emotion regulation work, helping people handle and create a gap between the trigger and the response. So emotional regulation. When I think that they're at a good place of regulation, I'll try to do things that are even way scarier down the line, because sometimes I feel like when we work only at a hierarchical level, we're enforcing or reinforcing in a way that there's danger at the top. And I actually don't believe that. My experience has been for many people that even doing things that are even more difficult can be manageable. And then you gain so much confidence. So my big word, and I think this comes from Russ Harris, the willingness to do things. Willingness, not do you want to. You don't want to, but really the willingness to do so. And I want to mention one more thing, that before doing the exposure practices, I do a lot of, Katie likes to call it, I call it assurance. Katie, I forget what you called it last time we spoke. You want to get
affirmation.
You want to get clarity. Are you a serial killer or not? I know you have intrusive thoughts that you're going to maybe kill somebody, or that thing is going to cause a disease, or whatever it is that you're worried about. I like to do problem solving. What is a signal? This is from, I think, Reed Wilson too. What is a signal and what is noise? And a signal and noise doesn't necessarily mean what is impossible to happen and what could possibly happen, because we're not getting absolute certainty. A signal is something we've defined, for example, that, this contamination concern that I'm worried about is not 100% okay, but I've decided it's fine. I can take that 99.8% risk based on my understanding. So then I'm going to call it noise. When I get the intrusive thought, I'm going to detect that that's not a signal, that's noise. And when there's noise, it's response prevention. And that's kind of what I do. I'm very passionate about creating spiritually aligned exposures. And that means that someone can just say, you know what? I know that this might be better for me to do. I'm just not willing to do it. So you know what? We work with the framework that someone's willing to do. We can get better within a certain framework. Maybe sometimes they'll change their mind and be willing to do more, but it's never going against the values. And that's some of the stuff I do before starting ERP.
That's great, Noah. My goodness. You covered most of the things I think that I want to cover. I think of the Viktor Frankl quote, in between stimulus and response is a choice. Would you say that that's a big part of ERP?
Wow, it is. Did he do ERP? He maybe in his own way, but it was.
I thought he had some kind of systematic desensitization stuff. Yeah, something like that.
Amazing.
All right, so we've got the uncertainty part, and I'm trying to remember. Was that you, Katie?
No, I think that was still Noah.
Okay,
No.
Noah.
It's not.
No,
that was me. Sorry, just ignore me.
We're leaning into our own uncertainty here.
That's okay.
I'm uncertain. I don't think it's me.
No, just ignore me. Clearly, everyone is watching my own uncertainty clearly with what I'm presenting on today. So that's wonderful. Well, if you go to the next slide, I think it's the introduction to me. I must have done these out of order. So,
listen, everybody, Katie is our superstar. Literally,
yep,
this conference would not be happening without Katie. So we can forgive Katie.
Oh, thank you for giving me. No, I love so much doing this work and truly appreciate it, and want to spend a few minutes talking about uncertainty. And I know we kind of started to talk about this a little bit with Noah, but want to start to note that faith really has nothing to do with certainty. And some might even argue that faith is the opposite of certainty, requiring a level of belief and risk in leaping toward the unknown. And according to Paul Tillich, faith is not the absence of doubt, but the courage to embrace uncertainty. And while this courage really can be challenging for everyone, the distorted notion that certainty is needed for faith in the divine can be even more challenging and terrifying for individuals grappling with OCD. And that is very much the experience that I've had, and of course, many folks that I've worked with have. Since OCD is a doubting disorder marked by the intolerance of uncertainty, it makes sense that leaning into religious faith can be particularly challenging for this population. And although embracing uncertainty, whether it's in religion or beyond, is a part of the human condition, folks with OCD often feel like they are the only ones lacking the certainty necessary for faith. So I would say that perhaps they, or maybe their OCD, is misunderstanding actually how faith is defined to begin with. Recently, I lead a whole series of interfaith support groups. I'm launching an interfaith faith and OCD community called Stick with the Ick, and love getting to work with people from different religious backgrounds. And recently was leading a group, and one individual shared, faith doesn't ask you to know, it asks you to believe. OCD, on the other hand, asks you to know, and that is different. And I think this distinction perfectly describes what it means not only to be a public theologian, but what I always say in seminary is that I'm a publicly uncertain theologian, that I am very public about not being certain about anything and okay with that, embracing faith and uncertainty as two sides of that same beautiful coin, and recognizing that faith is knowledge within the heart and beyond the reach of proof. So I think it's really important to note as we talk about uncertainty, as we talk about all of this, that yes, uncertainty is particularly challenging for folks with OCD. And when we're talking about scrupulosity in particular, when we're talking about themes related to religion or to morality, it's important to note that this is not an OCD issue. This is not a faith issue. This is not a religious or a spiritual or a theological issue. This is an OCD issue. And yet, the concept of embracing uncertainty is something that I think we can address in really special theological and spiritual realms as we move through treatment. So, in going to the next slide, I wanted to note that, when we're thinking about scrupulosity, when we're thinking about religious themes, again, it's when we're going through treatment, ERP that Noah started to describe, it's not about asking someone to step away from God or asking someone to oppose their spiritual practices. Because the reality is, when we're doing compulsions, when we are engaging with OCD, I always feel strange saying this, but I really believe it. We are worshiping OCD. We aren't worshiping God. We aren't worshiping the divine. We are literally doing those things in favor of the OCD. So when we're engaging in ERP, it's never about opposing religion. It's never about opposing spirituality. It's rather about reuniting with God from a space of meaning, no longer dictated by the disorder. So treatment really across religious and spiritual traditions offers us an opportunity to engage in something challenging in favor of no longer worshiping OCD, so that we can fully worship the divine in authentic and value-driven ways, so that we can reconnect with God. So some examples: for 7 years as an interfaith school chaplain, I watched my students from various religious and spiritual backgrounds find meaning through their sacred practices while sharing beliefs compassionately with one another. I witnessed community holy celebrations led by our Hindu students that spread joy and colored powder all around our campus. I participated with our Jewish students in Seder dinners during Passover, eager to share the Exodus narrative with others. And I witnessed our Christian students host a special light to darkness service, all of these different things. And I was always so filled with pride watching our older students even play games with elementary school students fasting for Ramadan for the first time. And these examples and so many more, for me, represent the way that faith connects individuals in beautiful ways through meaning and a desire for common understanding. It's one of the reasons that I love the conference that we're at today so much, because we see so many people from different backgrounds connecting with one another. And I think sometimes it can be difficult to articulate. We're talking, broadly here about faith, about spiritual practices, and it can be difficult to articulate a normative theology across religious and spiritual traditions. But really, for me, working with this diverse body of students helped me to see that each individual's beautiful rituals and practices of faith were a way for them to return to homeostasis. In other words, even in the most challenging times, faith was about moving toward meaning, about moving toward hope in the midst of the struggle. And yet that desire for meaning, connection, comfort, and community that characterize normative, value-driven faith across religious and spiritual traditions is vastly different, we know, from the driving force of OCD. On the surface, an individual seeking to live out their faith in a devout manner and an individual navigating scrupulosity might look really similar. But as we started to describe, and even as Noah began to describe for us, the function of rituals and practices for someone with OCD is a little bit different. An individual with OCD or who is engaging in practices from a space of scrupulosity is driven by urgency, fear, distress, guilt, and shame. So when it comes to OCD, as I said a second ago, we know that embracing uncertainty is a key component of kind of overcoming this doubting disorder, while an individual seeks to reclaim their life and move toward their values. And interestingly enough, I always think it's important to note that embracing uncertainty of all themes, not just religious scrupulosity, is a component of faith across many religious and spiritual traditions. And kind of the neat thing that I tend to see when we're thinking about this is individuals moving through ERP and this has been kind of my life for the last 3 years, connect in such beautiful ways with God. It might not, they may not be doing things exactly the same way that they did before their OCD treatment. But when I actually ask individuals, and I see this in the Muslim community, in the Jewish community, in the Christian community, it's, well, I'm actually connecting with God, maybe for the first time, in a way that's authentic to me and that isn't dictated by my OCD. And in looking at some examples across religious and spiritual traditions, I just have some quotes here from my podcast and some guests that were on. The first being Rabbi Noah, who is here with us today, who said, "What a spiritual thing. It's a spiritual practice. This ERP is just the practicing, applying faith, faith in your clergy, who you might be working with, faith in the therapist, faith in the world, faith in God. Very spiritual to me, even when it's the most secular case." Or we have Caitlin Claggett Woods from the Catholic tradition, who is also participating and leading at this conference today, who says, "Treatment is an exercise of practicing that trust in God, shifting over to trust in God that you know cares for you, to trust God is living faith." And then finally, Mubina Mirza, who is also participating and leading in our conference today as a clinician who works often with Muslim individuals, says, "There is no conflict between ERP and our faith." And I would say in general, there is no conflict between ERP and faith, because ERP can be sensitive to a person's belief system, like Noah talked about. Whether they follow an organized religion or they're atheist or agnostic, ERP can be sensitive to a person's belief system. And I would argue, taking that even a step further beyond being sensitive, that ERP can actually help someone stop worshiping OCD and reconnect with worshiping the divine. So if we shift to the next slide here, I always come back to this idea that ERP doesn't oppose faith. It didn't oppose faith yesterday. It won't oppose faith today. It won't oppose faith tomorrow. Rather, it helps individuals return to a healthy, value-driven version of faith. And I really believe you can actually become more connected to the divine and to your faith practices. I always say, speaking as a minister, I spent a good chunk of my ministry, particularly in school chaplaincy, plagued by OCD, navigating harm OCD, navigating moral scrupulosity, and feeling very much distanced from God. And to an external person, it was like, yes, she is doing all of the things, and she is praying, and she's leading all the services and doing all of these practices. But so much of what I was doing, I was so plagued the entire time, even if it wasn't what we would think of as quote unquote religious scrupulosity related rituals. My entire life was driven by engaging in mental compulsions, on proving that I was a good person, that I hadn't done anything wrong, that I was still worthy of being loved by God. And it was actually only in going through ERP and coming out the other side that I was able to move back to a space of actually being present with God in the midst of my life, in the midst of my ministry, in the midst of my practices. And I felt like even in ministry, my faith through treatment developed in ways that I never thought possible. I think the last piece that I want to address before we keep moving on is this idea that faith or that a leap of faith in treatment is something that can take place that's really, really beautiful, that we actually can take this leap of faith as we move through OCD treatment. And I think this can take place with scrupulosity or really with any theme. And I recently asked our IOCDF special interest group, some of the folks on the task force and our virtual community, to complete the sentence: "A leap of faith in treatment, in OCD treatment, means what?" And I love these responses. I think this lets us know kind of what a spiritual thing this can be. So a leap of faith in OCD treatment means trusting the process and knowing that it's not about the content of your thoughts. A leap of faith in OCD treatment means you can either reach for your matches to light the way or let your eyes adjust to the dark. A leap of faith in OCD treatment means surrendering in so many ways to trust God and my providers. A leap of faith in OCD treatment means allowing the worst case scenarios to take a back seat to all of the beautiful possibilities ahead with God. A leap of faith in treatment means to surrender to a higher power, to God, to uncertainty, or simply to life. Taking a leap of faith in treatment means that even when everything in you is screaming that it's unsafe, you trust your values to guide you through, and this leads to freedom. A leap of faith in treatment means that even when the darkness of OCD surrounds me, if I keep pushing, I will find light. And taking a leap of faith in treatment means doing religious practices out of joy instead of out of fear. And finally, I love this. Someone said, taking a leap of faith in treatment means having faith in my treatment team, faith in evidence-based treatments for OCD, and faith in my own capacities for growth and learning. And what a beautiful thing. And we're going to shift now into Justin, actually talking a little bit about, well, what are some best practices in ERP in this treatment that can really help individuals reconnect with God?
Little old me. I'm so happy to be covering this because I'm such a nerd for this. Really, all of this. It's just such an honor to, anyway, lest I go on and on and on about this. So best practices. I'm going to fly through some of this stuff as multiple points have been covered. But first of all, an evidence-based treatment has been studied, it's researched, there's specific protocols to follow, but most people are getting evidence-based practice. Whoops, I think I've got some auto timer going on here. Evidence-based practice may cover any number of things. It's not necessarily, hey, let's sit down for 12 sessions, do this, do this, do this, do this. We're taking evidence-based treatments and applying those to day-to-day practice. And so part of day-to-day practice can be other comorbidities that we're working on, sometimes even things like social skills building. And we might mix in ACT, acceptance and commitments. We might label some emotions. What? How does that make you feel? Certainly doing functional assessments and any number of things. CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, by the way, which is the treatment of choice for OCD, it's not just this ERP hammer. It is the essential ingredients of the gold standard treatment, but there's a lot that goes into CBT. So part of evidence-based practice, too, is assessing faith and also, in some instances, actually applying it in treatment. Now, different clients handle this differently, have different interests, different desires, respond in different ways. And there are some really clear points of research, but we are also on a kind of the initial frontier of studying faith with mental health treatments and how that might even be integrated. So some things are still remarkably messy in the process, but that need not keep us from validating any number of things, such as the fact that most people find conversation around spiritual things as very important to them and would like to incorporate that in their treatment. But on the clinician side, I can speak for us and say that a lot of clinicians are just scared, nervous, just like most graduate programs are not really digging into ERP. Most graduate level programs may have, of course, a diversity class or sensitivity or world religions or any number of things, but definitely not an integration piece. So one important point that I wanted to bring up is that it's commonly a concern that, whoa, I see a Jewish rabbi and an interfaith chaplain and Justin, who's Christian and also works with a lot of backgrounds. And so you're just simply saying that we all hold hands together and all beliefs are the same. There's no differences. There's no diversity. And we are not saying that at all. Rather, we're really affirming that there's a scientific treatment that works most of the time. And it's not incongruent with faith practice. And in fact, many faith traditions find it very congruent. And I just wanted to provide a couple of quick examples. In Jainism, it emphasizes harmony between mind and soul. And ERP also requires mindfully tolerating discomfort. It teaches to live through rather than to fight. And so when it comes down to an intrusion, that tendency to review, why did I have that? What's going on? Did I say something? Well, from a Jain spiritual practice perspective, it's going to look at it and say, be mindful in the moment, not to be stuck in a theoretical past, which works really well with ACT for those who know it, and to be in the present, to not suppress it, not to pretend like it's not there, but to be mindful with it. And even in Catholicism as well, like if we take confession, it's considered a sacrament of reconciliation with God. So ERP actually, when a person is avoiding it because they're afraid that they're going to spin out into a 4-hour confession, for example, ERP, it can be used both as the clinical practice, but it can also be used as a discipline to help that person spiritually to get back on track and follow the guidance of their confessor, their priest, etc. But we're not saying there's no differences, quite the contrary. But first of all, let me talk about the clinical recommendations to stay on track. And I'm going to bounce forward a little bit because I want to show this handout, and anybody who desires to be to check this out, to look it up right now, Dr. Jonathan Abramowitz's website. If you go there, I think it's jabramowitz.com, something like that. You just Google it, exposure practice form. He has this for free. And so really the core element of it, at least as I see it, is these first 3 questions. Designing an exposure. What is it you're going to face? What is it you're going to give up? What is it you're going to give up? Second question, what do you fear most will happen during this exposure? Which a lot of times is the core fear, but it can also be even more directly involved in the situation of, I think I'm just going to have a really bad day. Maybe that person isn't concerned in that moment of the core fear. And then how long can you stick with this task? Feel free to check out this form. Even while we're talking, yes, we give you permission to hit up Google if you're doing that. So I want to bounce back to some of those important steps, though. So first of all, it is about 2 things, exposure and response prevention. Good treatment is based on strong assessment, and also assessment is treatment. I discovered from the expert clinicians that I trained under and have learned from and still learn from today and consult with, that slowing down to get there quicker is such an essential tenet of good ERP, really any good treatment. And the more complexity is, the more we have to slow down. So of course, a proper diagnosis. I still, despite being a majority of cases that have OCD, I still get a lot of folks that come into my practice and their provider said, oh yeah, you have OCD, and folks thinking that they had OCD. And I'd say about once a month, I have a good conversation like, no, it's not OCD. That's actually just the popular term. Like, I think we're actually talking about orderliness, or maybe control in other ways, or anxiety that fits into some of these factors. And that's good news. I'm glad. I don't wish a chronic diagnosis on anyone. And so we talk about that. But treatment is going to be different based on the diagnosis. And even though ERP is ERP is ERP, OCD is OCD is OCD is OCD, there are differences. A person struggling with pedophilia OCD is going to experience a special level of shame, if I can put it that way, compared to the person that has contamination obsessions. But we're still working with the same treatment protocols. We need to assess. And one of the biggest things that clients do, and I encourage clients to develop a relationship with, is to track, to monitor, to have successful ways where they, and also their support community, helps them to tune into when is it going well, when is it going poorly, when is a person lapsing, relapsing, etc. So assessment is so crucial. Preparing is essential. So a lot of mistakes that I've seen clinically are folks that jump in with no plan, no preparation. They have the desire for OCD to be gone in a day, and they treat it that way. And it would be like any number of things that a person may want to go away immediately. I don't know if you all have experienced this, but if I sprain my wrist or any other thing like that, I find myself constantly checking it. Is it better? Is it better? But I'm making it worse in many cases by moving it. And so it's really easy to do that by, one, getting overly excited that there is a treatment that works, but preparing is very, very important. So we're going to do things like conceptualize core fears. So we're not just doing this scatter spray of, well, try this, you're afraid of this, you're afraid of this. We're going to organize that together If you think of it as a video game, we're going to go for the big boss, so to speak. If we can just go for Bowser, like in Mario, as opposed to all these little side minions and jump on 1,000 little turtles, then it's really going to help us in treatment. And setting target concerns is part of that. It's a conversation. These things change and will change. Some things will change over time. We want to review it as we go. We're testing negative predictions. We want to see how we can take it further. It is messy. The best clinicians in the world are still case consulting with other best clinicians in the world. I want you to hear that. So it's messy. And yes, there are some obvious red flags. If you get into it, somebody says ERP, and then all of a sudden you're shaking some rain sticks and I don't know, doing some random stuff. Like, okay, trust your gut with it. But in a general sense, you may be afraid that OCD is not, or ERP is not working. Well, I'm sorry, that's pretty standard. And you can't actually test whether ERP is working shy of many practices done well, and usually over a good amount of time, like a month or two. So therapists really help with staying grounded in this. Problem solving, it's not when, it's not if, it's when. A lot of it's about expectation setting and being honest as well. Actual problems do occur, and hear me out. If you run into problems, it's not necessarily because of you. I mean, if you are lazy, then own it. But most people, it's legitimate tripping points. It's complex. Nobody is walking to the table saying, yeah, I just want to keep suffering with OCD. And so compassion goes a long way here. And there's going to be a lot of adaptation. So here's this handout again. And if the slides are downloadable, that's a hyperlink too that can be clicked on. I'm going to jump into face-sensitive recommendations to wrap up my section, and then we're going to discuss a few things here. I wanted to do a little bit more than just top-of-head thoughts. And so what I did here is I pulled from some research, but to be clear, we are really early on. To be straightforward, we have no singular protocol of exactly what to do in faith integration. And for a lot of people, that's enough for them to just be out of it. For me, it's enough for my clients to say, this is important. This intersects with OCD. I care about this. I want to grow in these ways, to say, yeah, absolutely. I'm going to work within my training, my ethics, my limits. But we can pull from various things. For those of you that are clinicians, Vietin et al., I think it was 2016-17, talked about competency, and they have 7 competency keys. I provided 5 that are really applicable to clients. So this is a really open session. If I had to guess, a majority of folks are probably sufferers, family members, so I don't want to get too clinical, even in my nerdiness. But these are 5 of the 7 that would apply directly to what people need to look for in faith-sensitive treatments. So the first is that rapport and willingness. Katie and Noah have done an excellent job of emphasizing this. There has to be rapport with the treatment team. There has to be trust, and especially willingness as a key ingredient. And I think that this is true with anything mental health, because we're talking about emotions and internal relations to things and relationships, and also the spiritual. And so a person, take a child or a teen who doesn't want to be in therapy as the classic example. They could be there. They could go to therapy 20 times, and therapy recommends 20 times of ERP, and they could theoretically do all of the exposures. But it's back to what Noah was saying. Without the RP, it doesn't matter. And I tell people, like, hey, don't force yourself to just do the E's, the exposure. It's silly. It's just making yourself more distressed. So there's a lot of ways where we'll say white knuckling is a form of avoidance in treatment. So yeah, we need a little e, big RP there, as Katie said to the side, on the side. So also, if you struggle with scrupulosity, I think it's all the more important to really be clear about the willingness piece, because also what even if the clinician is gracious and isn't really going to push you in inappropriate ways, it can feel like more of a violation sometimes if something is set up and the person's just kind of like, I guess, but they feel forced to do it. So that rapport and willingness is huge. Regular assessment, I'm not going to spend much more time. You can look at the slides separately. Just being crisp with this, we're going to talk about this in a second, is key. So knowing what is the value, and if it's a value, it can be written down on paper. If it's a defensible belief that you have from a worldview perspective, it can be written down on paper. If it's an exposure, there will be a rationale and it can be written down on paper. Now, be careful, because we don't want to do this at every turn. Like, oh, I need to sit down and write down my rationale. In most cases, OCD gets severe quickly. You won't have enough time in the world. We need that for a few key examples to get the ball rolling. But at the end of the day, there needs to be a rationale of, I am facing this, and this is what I'm removing or reducing. And then if we bring in the act side of things in service of this value. So regular assessment is huge, and talked about the extra assessment for spiritual values. ACT really helps. This is what's called the hexaflex, the 6 processes in ACT. And so on the right side, you have valuing and committed actions. Getting really clear about that is important. I've got a worksheet here in a second to do that. Okay, so differentiation is also really key. Integrating faith and spiritual concerns is not saying it's all the same or it doesn't matter. Okay, let's just spiritualize this practice, or let's just clinicalize the spiritual. No, we're going to objectively identify what is ERP and what is faith practice. And here's this worksheet, also a hyperlink in the files. The piece of worksheet from Alec Pollard and his posse up in St. Louis, the St. Louis Behavioral Medicine Institute. And it's a great form. Alec Pollard, actually, we're on one of the talks here today on the advanced panel for clinicians for scrupulosity. And he talks about how he commonly does this up front in multiple times to get commitments as to what the person will do, so that later if the person's like, well, I said that I'd watch a PG-13 movie that has attractive women in it, but I don't know. I went home and I was reading in my Bible and it said that a man who looks lustfully, ... whatever it is. It's, yes, everything can be a conversation at a later point, but we want to come back to say, hey, remember what you said last week in this commitment? You said that if it were a sin, you could do this, but here's the commitment. This format is just a great example of one of the many tools that clinician, clergy, any number of folks have to work with along the way. And that diversity actually provides direction. Practices need to be diverse, need to appreciate the person. And I'm not just talking about the difference between care between a Jewish or Muslim person or Christian or fill in the blank. But I'm talking about the person with I forget how to put this, but within themselves, because as a person grows through ERP, they may discover, oh my goodness, I have shut down certain parts of myself. I shut down going to whatever church this evening. I didn't go to this thing that I otherwise would. Maybe it's a worship night. Maybe it's a fill in the blank because it was so triggering. And so exposures need to also change with the person. There's diversity within the person, but then from person to person as well. There's really a lot there. Time doesn't allow us, other than Q&A here in a little bit. But last comment that I'll make as to the major bullet points to be on point with this is clergy collaboration. So involve community and clergy when necessary or when desired. It doesn't have to be this end of road. Oh my goodness, I've had 10 therapists and nothing has worked. I guess I'll reach out to Rabbi Noah Tile and bring him in. No, like this. I get people on releases fast, quickly, whenever it's going to be useful. And sometimes we might need to educate clergy. Sometimes clergy knows way more and understands way more than is given credit, but that oftentimes becomes important. Jed Siv had said religion is a form of culture. Scrupulosity is perhaps the quintessential OCD manifestation in which issues of culture, values, and diversity are entangled with symptoms. But I'm going to extend that a little bit further, since we're talking about just ERP as a spiritual practice. Even if you just struggle with contamination or general existential thoughts or whatever else, we just need to be really clear about what's the culture, what's the value, what's the diversity here, but also what's ERP. I have a bunch of extra tips, but sorry, you have to pay extra for that. No, I'm teasing. But I want to leave you with Psalm 23:4. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. And as a Christian, I often go to this verse, and many others do as well. And I think ERP oftentimes comes down to, this is a bit of my own personal opinion and distillation, but ERP comes down to truth and obedience and faithfulness, which requires discipline. Am I really willing to face that thing that's actually occurring in my brain, the thought, the image, the whatever it is that I'm scared of? Am I willing to face it down? And am I willing to open myself up to the possibility that others have gotten better? There's other options that are out there that can be faith congruence, and many times are. And more than just faith congruence, might actually be part of me growing spiritually in that next step of faith. And obedience and faithfulness always requires persistence and discipline. So I'm going to wrap with that on my end. We're going to talk just briefly about making this your own. I'm trying to remember, Katie, were you the one?
I think Noah was going to chat a little bit about this. Yeah.
I can jump in for a few. I don't see anything though.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry.
Perfect. So great minds think alike. So the key here is less the particular verses that speak to you, but the idea of learning holy texts. There is, but I have a secret to tell everybody. OCD wasn't created with the diagnosis creation of OCD. It's been going on in different forms for forever. People, a lot of this stuff is ancient and deep, and I think that the reason why we're so passionate about the intersection of faith and mental health practices is because there is a lot of overlap, and learning spiritual texts is an incredible way to orient yourself to what you really care about. For me, as Justin was alluding to, lo iraraki atayimadi, I'm not fearing anything wrong, because you direct relationship. When you say you, it's a direct relationship. You are with me through that practice. Numbers below taturu, not to run after your desires. A lot of OCD practice is about, or OCD therapy is about, not running after the fast racing desires that your brain is telling you to do as a way to keep safe. We have to actually go against what seems very natural, because because those instincts have been sort of hijacked by the OCD. I think a big one for me as well is tamim tia, just to be simple and wholehearted. Even though life is deep and spirituality can be complicated, but there's an element of being simple and pure and just kind of balanced and healthy. Faith not being certainty, but the courage to live with uncertainty. Using holy text is so valuable. You don't need to read it in a way where every time you get triggered, you then read the text and then feel better. That's when we get worried about it. But it's wonderful to have, these coping thoughts throughout the day that remind you, not when you're triggered necessarily, or not when you're triggered, hopefully, but when you're just, going about your day and want to be reminded of what you love and care about. I think prayer is a big, big, big thing for people too. I know, but a thing that is also so important is prayer can be a compulsion. Of course it can. But also, it can be an exposure. Praying in a healthy way, that's an exposure too. Sometimes people might choose for a while to refrain from prayers if they've been excessively praying and have no vessel to pray healthily. But prayer is a powerful tool, both in the belief that it can help and that it can work, but also because it helps us internalize our values on a deep emotional level. And there's a really good place for that. So learning text, prayer, sacred relationships, and community. It's unbelievable how people benefit from being in an environment where they can talk to other people about what is going on, and just being with other people, because when you're with other people and you have to focus your senses on the world around you, it's much harder to just come to do rituals all the time. And so being around community takes you out of your really individual world and brings you to the world of other people, and that makes you much less subjective and stuck. But the key is that everything exists with assurance without excessive reassurance.
No, and I'll just add, I love the idea of assurance, and I always say affirmation and hope, I think, is so necessary. We can offer those things without offering reassurance. And just to add on to what Rabbi Noah was saying, the prayer component, yes, of course, anything can be compulsive. We really have to think about the reason that someone is engaging in something. Anything can be value-driven or compulsive. And it really can be value-driven to move to praying in a way that is not compulsive, especially maybe if someone throughout their life, I'll say for me, for such a long time before I understood OCD, it was, oof, God, please take away these intrusive thoughts. And we know that that is compulsive. That is not helpful. That makes OCD come on even stronger. But we can turn that around. We can do that in a different way to ask for strength, saying something to the effect of, God, please give me the strength to lean into discomfort or to sit with uncertainty. This feels hard and scary, but I know that you're walking alongside me. Please give me the courage to use my tools as I offer myself compassion and lean into treatment, moving toward the beautiful life that you've given me. And this can look so different across different religious and spiritual traditions and the ways that people connect with God. But I think it's a really beautiful thing to let individuals know that we can pray for strength in the midst of this really hard process. This can be a spiritual aspect. I know that we are a little bit over on our time, so we are going to go ahead and say goodbye to you and shift and bring you all into our Q&A, which we are so excited about, to be able to chat with you a little bit more and to hear what you have to say.
We might be wearing different clothes.
We're going to do a Taylor Swift clothes change here. Exactly. Give us a second. We'll see you in a moment.